Welcome to On the Moneyline, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm Newsome, and I'm here to break down UFC Sao Paulo, which goes down this weekend, of course, after the 1 week break we had last weekend. I love these Brazilian events. The crowd are always wild and, packed full of Brazilian fighters as well. It's always made for a really fun event. So, yeah, really happy that we've got a card in Brazil, one of the cards that are in the lead up to the running of the end of the year. So yeah, not too many cards left. Happy that we've got one in Brazil. Just before we get started with the breakdowns, as always, there is a Base AI recap, which is already live on our YouTube channel in the Base AI specific playlist from the last event at UFC 294 in Abu Dhabi. Of course, it was an amazing event. So again, that's recapped from the AI perspective. If you are interested in AI in general, but AI for MMA in the UFC, then make sure you check that out on youtube.com/MMA Play 365. And with that out of the way, we're going to jump straight into the breakdowns. We've got 13 fights to break down in total. We start, as always, in the main event, which is the UFC heavyweight division between Jailton Almeida versus Derrick Lewis. Now, this was originally Almeida versus Curtis Blaydes. I'm not going to lie, I'm really disappointed that Curtis Blaydes has pulled out in regards to, just watching this fight play out and, how that fight would have played out. I love Jiu-Jitsu ace versus world-class wrestler, although Blaydes hasn't been wrestling too much lately, but ultimately that's what we had. That's the predominant styles. Almeida was the jiu-jitsu ace, Blaydes was the wrestler. Unfortunately, we're not going to get that fight, and in comes the badass Derrick Lewis, the hardest hitter in the UFC, and that adds an element of, just a little bit of uncertainty in this fight, because we've seen Lewis against fighters that predominantly are wrestlers or grapplers that want to take him down. Look at that fight with Blaydes, for example. When Blaydes shot in for the takedown, Lewis timed the uppercut, knocked him out cold, and it literally does take one punch from Lewis, one lapse of concentration from the opponent, or one mistake, and if that punch lands, that's all she wrote. And that's what Derrick Lewis brings to the table. So from Almeida's perspective, he's definitely got to mind his P's and Q's, but Almeida is quite a heavy favourite in this fight, minus 450, minus 500, and you can understand why, because if Lewis doesn't connect with that first punch before Almeida ties up with him or shoots a takedown, then I don't believe Derrick Lewis is going to win the fight. I think that it's either going to be the first punch that lands on Almeida that knocks him out, or Almeida gets to the takedown, gets the fight down to the mat. And I just don't think that Lewis will get up after that first takedown, and I don't think he'll survive the rest of the round either, unless, of course, Almeida does sit on the outside, uses some kicks, uses some, jabs, some long-range strikes where he's not in the danger of getting knocked out, and then shoots that takedown with like 20 seconds to go of the round. And of course, I think Lewis would survive 20 seconds, but that's not Almeida's game. Almeida will, especially with Lewis in front of him, he knows that Lewis hits hard as fuck. So for Almeida, it's going to be a case of, look, just time it right, be a little bit patient for maybe the first 30 seconds, but I do feel that takedown's going to come early, and like I say, if Lewis doesn't knock Almeida out before that early takedown, I think it's going to be a wrap. I think Almeida will take him down once, and that's all he'll need. I think with either ground and pound or a submission. And again, Almeida's got that aura about him, similar to Khabib. Like, at one point, it was really difficult to know whether Khabib's going to finish with ground and pound or finish with a submission, and that's what you get with Almeida. It almost depends on what the opponent's going to show. Like, if they're going to leave a neck exposed, then he'll take a neck. If they're going to remain really tight and, really caged up from the submission opportunity perspective, then Almeida will just land strikes and finish via ground and pound. And yeah, I just think it's a really bad fight for Lewis. He needs to connect early in this fight, and it just gives him such a low percentage chance of winning because it's a small window of opportunity. I'm not sure whether I've said this before, but I do believe Almeida is going to be a UFC champion. He does need to tighten his striking up, but at the minute he's running through everybody without needing striking, and I think that's going to be the case again on Saturday night. So for those reasons, I'm picking Jailton Almeida to win this fight. Next up, co-main event, we've got another big favourite, and rightly so as well. We've got Gabriel Bonfim versus Nicolas Dalby. Now, look, first things first, props to Dalby for taking this fight. You know, not only is he stepping into a Brazilian's backyard, which I'm sure there's not many fighters that are going to have their hands up ready for that, but also to fight Gabriel Bonfim, who is looking like a legitimate prospect who at some point is going to hit the top 10, hit the top 5, hit the top 3, potentially be a title challenger as well, and maybe even a champion one day. He's still really young, but the reason why he's hyped is because he's so good everywhere. His boxing's clean and sharp. His wrestling seems to be able to work alongside or work for him in regards to the grappling, because he's such a legit grappler as well, with legit submission threats. And like I say, he's big, he's physical, he's fast, he hits hard. Gabriel Bonfim's got everything, and that's what makes him and makes people like me. Because again, there's going to be other people that break down fights that are going to be saying the exact same thing as me. This is what makes Bonfim a legit hyped prospect, because of the way he is. The only knock on Bonfim that I could possibly critique him for is the fact that he is a little bit hittable at times. So he can come forwards, and whilst he's swinging within the exchanges, if he's facing an opponent that will land punches in between the punches that Bonfim lands within the exchanges, then he can be got at. So maybe at some point he gets chin checked and knocked out, but you know, I don't feel that that's going to be an issue for Bonfim, A, in this fight, and B, until he does hit that top 10 and he's fighting other fighters that are likely going to not get overwhelmed with what Bonfim offers. In regards to Nicolas Dalby, again, he's a well-rounded fighter, decent striker, decent wrestler, decent grappler, but I don't think he's got the punching power and the ability and the striking ability to land within the exchanges that Bonfim's landing on the feet to be able to chin check him and knock him out. I think in regards to the wrestling, maybe Dalby's, maybe it's even with the wrestling. Bonfim's not this beast wrestler, but he does have a good ability to get the fight down to the mat. But the problem is, even if Dalby, let's say hypothetically, he is the better wrestler here and he takes Bonfim down, then Bonfim's by far the better grappler. So again, it's another one of those fights where, like I said in the introduction, we've got a heavy favourite in Bonfim who is like minus 500, minus 600. And I do understand it, because I just feel that it's a perfect fight for him on a good stage in a co-main event. And like I say, I feel like he's going to be the better striker. If he isn't the better wrestler and he gets taken down, then, he's the better grappler. But then he could also take Dalby down as well. And therefore, again, better grappler on top. It's a difficult fight for Dalby, in my opinion. It's one for Bonfim to win. And I really hope that if Bonfim does win this fight, that the UFC put him against, again, just keep giving him the step-ups in competition, because that's what we need. We don't want the step up and then a step down. Doesn't work. He's young, he's hungry, he's good everywhere, he's hyped. Let's get him in some major fights after this. But for this fight against Dalby, I'm picking Gabriel Bonfim to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Rodrigo Nascimento versus Jailton Almeida in the heavyweight division. Again, another decent fight. And look, the one thing I will say with Nascimento is I like Nascimento as a fighter. I think he's a decent striker. He's calm, he's composed. He's a nasty grappler, heavy top game. Like if he gets on top of you, you ain't shifting him. But he's also got good jiu-jitsu transitions to work with that. And then he's also got a wrestling game to complement the grappling as well. So I do like Nascimento as a fighter, I really do. I was a little underwhelmed with him last time out, though, against Ali Latifi. I bet Nascimento relatively heavily, and I can't remember the line, but it wasn't like a pick'em or anything like that. But I bet Nascimento. I was a little bit underwhelmed. I did think he won the fight, but against someone like Latifi, and no disrespect to Latifi, but it was a fight, in my opinion, that Nascimento should have really grasped with both hands and looked great in doing so. But instead, it was a close fight, one that, went to a decision, and you're thinking, if it does go the other way to Latifi, you can't really complain too much. But he did end up getting the win. Rightfully so, in my opinion, but the point is the fight was much closer than what it should have been. And I'm kind of looking at this in a similar way. Look, Jailton Almeida is a fighter that came into the UFC. At the start, in my opinion, it didn't look like Mays was going to be around for too long, but he has put some wins together. He has looked like he's improved his game everywhere as well. So rightfully so, he's still a UFC fighter, and he is a UFC caliber fighter. Now, do I think he's going to win this fight? Spoiler alert, no, I don't. But it's just one of those fights that, again, I've just got a little bit of hesitancy just because of what I saw last time out with Nascimento. And look, Nascimento was like a minus 225 favourite in this fight. He has come down. There has been money coming on Mays, which I do understand. And now he's sitting around minus 180. So he's in and around that same price tag as he was last time out. And yeah, again, I think from a striking perspective, maybe Mays is the better striker, more explosive striker. He seems to move a little bit more and be a little bit more active on the feet. But then it's the wrestling and grappling. I feel like Nascimento will wrestle. I think he can take Mays down. And this is a good point to mention as well. Mays isn't the wrestler that Ilir Latifi was. So maybe Nascimento... And I don't think that Mays has also got the strength of Ilir Latifi as well, or the body type. So I kind of feel that Nascimento might have a better time in this fight wrestling and feel a little bit better wrestling as well. And therefore, the wrestling probably will play a factor. And then the topside grappling, if Mays is on his back, I just don't see him getting up from Nascimento. Whether Nascimento finishes him or just lays on top and just sees the minutes out and the rounds out. I think that Mays' best chance is to keep this fight standing early, try and knock Nascimento out, or at least hurt him to the point where Nascimento's on the back foot. But like I said, I don't see a scenario where Nascimento can't take Mays down. So again, there's hesitancy from the last fight, but there is, every fight is a different fight and styles make fights. I think that Mays is going to be easier to take down than what Latifi was, and that should be the difference maker. So for those reasons, I'm picking Rodrigo Nascimento to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Caio Borralho versus Abus Magomedov. Now, Magomedov was really disappointed in his last fight. I know he was fighting Strickland, who is now the UFC middleweight champion, but it's the way that fight went down. Like, Magomedov looked great in the first round, but he really did look like he emptied a gas tank in that first round, and then he just completely fell off a cliff from that first round, and then Strickland did end up getting the finish. But it was just the fact that Magomedov just didn't really have any fight left in him, and it does beg some questions. And look, I bet Magomedov in that last fight against Strickland. I'll tell you when I win a bet and I'll tell you when I lose a bet, always. I bet him at plus money in the main event. I thought he could potentially cause Strickland some problems. And look, if he had the gas tank that he had in round one for at least 3 of those 5 rounds, he might have been able to do something, but he didn't. And the thing is with Caio Borralho, he's a very well-rounded fighter, but he's also a nasty grappler. His wrestling is okay. I do think he'll be able to tie up with Magomedov, which is the important thing here. Because if he can clinch up, especially against the cage, Borralho has a really good ability to use the trips and to sink a hook in whilst the fighter stood up, take the back of the fighter whilst they stood up, drag them down to the mat. He's got some real crafty, what I would call jiu-jitsu style takedowns. And once you show him half of your back, he will find ways to take you back. He's a very, very nasty positional grappler. On the feet striking, I think Magomedov has got the advantage. The one thing I will say with Magomedov is he uses kicks a lot, and that could be a good factor in this fight in regards to keeping the fight at range. Because if Caio Borralho is at range, then he's not getting in close to the clinch. However, the downside to the kicks is if Borralho catches a kick, you'll be able to take him down a little bit easier. So it's a bit of, pick your poison for Magomedov and what's going to work for him. Ultimately, when I'm looking at this fight, I'm analysing it, I just think that the path to victory in regards to getting the fight to the mat and controlling from a jiu-jitsu perspective is with Caio Borralho, especially in Brazil as well. Magomedov, again, he might have a good first round, but Borralho's tough. He's young, he's durable, he's full of confidence. And again, Magomedov coming off that loss against Strickland where he was hurt badly as well. I just think Borralho is going to be able to do a job on Magomedov in this fight. Again, I don't think he's going to run through him or anything. I do expect Magomedov to win a round along the way at some point, but it's the takedowns, those jiu-jitsu trip takedowns, and then the nasty positional jiu-jitsu of Borralho. Again, once he takes you back, you don't stand up from it. Even if he doesn't submit you, it's just very difficult to get him off you. And if Borralho can do that for at least 2 out of the 3 rounds, which I believe he can, then it's going to be a big problem for Magomedov. So for those reasons, I'm picking Caio Borralho to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fun one, a stylistic clash. We've got Rodolfo Vieira versus Armen Petrosyan. I feel like this one's going to split MMA fans, the Twitter X community, bettors. I think it's going to be one where, we've got 50% of one side on one side and then 50% of the other people on the other side. And like I said, it's a stylistic clash as well. So I completely understand, it's also split the bookies as well, because it's pretty much a dead even pick 'em. We did have Vieira as a favourite. We've had Petrosyan as a slight favourite. Now it seems to have settled quite even, -110, -115 on either side. So yeah, it seems to be that there's just a massive split between both fighters. Rodolfo Vieira, of course, is the elite world-class grappler. Armen Petrosyan, of course, is the world-class striker. And both of their weaknesses are where both of their strengths are in regards to, the opponent. So Armen Petrosyan, we saw against Caio Borralho, he was taken down, controlled on the mat. When he was fighting a legit BJJ player, he didn't really have an answer for it. Rodolfo Vieira, on the other hand, he's fighting a striker who, if this is a 15-minute kickboxing fight, then Petrosyan wins pretty close to 100% of the time. So, yeah, it's which fighter gets the game plan going. Now, the one thing that I will say about Rodolfo Vieira is he is improving his striking. Like, he went almost, well, no, he did go 3 rounds. I said almost because I wasn't sure if the fight hit the mat. I don't believe it did. But he went 3 rounds with Chris Curtis from a striking perspective. And sure, he lost, but his striking just looks so much better than we've seen before, especially for a grappler as well. So when it comes to styles, when you're forced to fight a style that you're not used to, you tend to tire a little bit more. So, for Vieira's perspective, if he's forced to strike, then he's going to tire. From a grappling perspective, he'll probably be able to go all day long. And vice versa, if there's a striker that's forced to wrestle and grapple, then he's going to tire out quicker, because that's the style that they're not used to holding the gas tank and cardio for. So for Vieira to go 3 rounds with Curtis and his cardio look okay, and again, the cardio is this big thing that everybody talks about and assumes that Vieira is a 1 round or bust type of fighter, which I completely disagree with. He's worked on his striking. Now, is that going to be enough to be competitive and win a striking fight versus Petrosyan? No, I don't think so at all. But what it does do is it enables him to be comfortable enough to not have to rush and force takedowns and expend energy in shooting takedowns that he can't get or that he's having to overwork for. And you look at Caio Borralho's fight against Petrosyan, some of the takedowns that Borralho hit, the open mat takedowns, are the exact type of takedowns that Vieira hits as well. So again, there's starting to be a little bit of upside on Vieira, in my opinion. Now, for Petrosyan's takedown defense isn't great at all. He defends 36% of takedowns, I think, or it might be 39. It's a low number, and he does get taken down by most fighters that want him down. And like I say, but when Borralho was taking him down, similar takedowns to Vieira. But the difference is, as good as an elite as a grappler as Borralho is, Vieira's better. So I do think Vieira is going to be able to get takedowns in this fight. It's just in between the takedowns, can Petrosyan really light him up on the feet and hurt him? It's a possibility. Look, Petrosyan's got a legit path to victory. Vieira's got a legit path to victory. It's a pick him for a reason. It seems to be splitting the fans and the MMA community for a reason as well. But I just think that Vieira can get takedowns in this fight. That's the question I ask myself, because if Vieira can't get takedowns, he loses the fight. But I do think that if he gets takedowns, he'll be able to control positions and win minutes, potentially find a submission on the mat. And that's the other thing. Even though Petrosyan's the better striker, I still think Vieira's got the finishing upside as well. I do think Vieira can get takedowns. So it does lean me very slightly towards Rodolfo Vieira. Look, if Petrosyan comes out here, lights Vieira up and knocks him out, I don't think anyone's going to be surprised. But again, when you're looking at edges and slight edges and certain upsides in different areas, it's like Vieira, if this fight goes to a decision and he's scored a takedown and got a load of control time in 2 of those 3 rounds, he's not had to expend too much cardio, and he's in a position where he could potentially win a decision. It all depends on where the fight plays out. Like I said, I think Vieira can get takedowns. I've seen Armen Petrosyan controlled by, I don't mean this disrespectfully, but a lesser grappler than Vieira. But Vieira is literally the elite of the elite, so that's no disrespect to Borralho. So, yeah, I'm siding slightly with the Brazilian here, so I'm picking Rodolfo Vieira to win this fight. And in the next fight, the other half of the Bonfim brothers, we've got Ismael Bonfim versus Vinc Pichel. And yeah, look, this Bonfim brother's also very good. If we are critiquing and, comparing both of the Bonfim brothers, I mean, in my opinion, Gabriel's the better fighter, but Ismael Bonfim has still got insane qualities about him. He's a great boxer. He can wrestle. He can grapple. And look, that loss against Benoit Saint-Denis, Saint-Denis was, a relatively sized underdog in that favourite, with Bonfim, of course, being the relatively sized favourite. And Bonfim dropped the ball, but man, that loss has aged well, if a loss can ever age well, because, look, Benoit Saint-Denis went in there against Thiago Moises, who was ranked higher than Bonfim and had been in the UFC longer, fought a better level of competition, and he took Thiago Moises out as well, completely dominated the fight. So Benoit Saint-Denis is just a beast, that forward pressure wrestler that, I don't think you can hold that loss against Bonfim at all. I still think Bonfim's a legit fighter. I still think he's going to be in the UFC for a long time, potentially ranked at some point in the future as well. And I think he's matched up well here against Vinc Pichel. Look, Pichel's dangerous. He hits hard. He's one of those fighters that will walk through strikes to make sure that he can land 2 or 3 of his own. So Bonfim's got to mind his P's and Q's here. If he takes his foot off the concentration pedal, makes a mistake, then Pichel, he's a veteran. He's been around for years and fought a high level of competition. He'll make you pay for any mistakes or any lapse in concentration. So Bonfim's got to keep his wits about him. But the reason I think it's a good fight is because of the boxing. Vinc Pichel, he used to wrestle heavily. He doesn't so much anymore. If he does in this fight, I think Bonfim's defensive wrestling and his defensive grappling is going to be enough to get up against Vinc Pichel. So I do think it's a fight that is more likely to be won and lost on the feet. But Bonfim's technical boxing, I think, compared to Vinc Pichel's more wild-styled, with the winging hooks, the looping punches, the power shots, exerting a lot of power into a lot of shots, I think Bonfim's boxing is that technical that is going to be able to find the openings, find the gaps to counter, land combinations within the punches that Vinc Pichel's landing, evade a lot of the punches, make Vinc Pichel miss a little bit as well. And I think once Bonfim starts putting those combinations together and landing cleanly on Pichel, I think he's got every chance of knocking him out as well. So, yeah, look, Pichel's a good fighter, a veteran, fought a high level of competition, like I've said already. There's a possibility he comes out here and knocks Bonfim out, but I just don't see it happening. I think it's a low percentage outcome. I think Bonfim's technical boxing, his defensive wrestling and grappling is going to be enough to, keep this fight standing. And then Bonfim, again, when he starts ripping to the body as well, he just does a really good job within his boxing, his target areas. And I think it's going to be too much on the night for Pichel. So for those reasons, I'm picking Ismael Bonfim to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Elves Brener versus Esteban Ribovics. And again, I think this is another fight that might split a lot of people, and it's a very difficult fight to be confident in my opinion, because, look, you've got Elves Brener, who was a big underdog against Takugov in his UFC debut. A lot of people were surprised by that decision. I think if you watch it without commentary, the fight's much closer than what it looks like when you're listening to the commentary. So I don't think it was a robbery. Again, it was a close fight that, in my opinion, could have gone either way. But obviously, at the time, it did look very close to a robbery. So Brener wins as a massive underdog there. Then he goes against Guram Kutateladze, who'd been in there with some great fighters, really solid fighter, good everywhere. Big underdog in that fight, wins that fight as well. And then now he's fighting Esteban Ribovics. So it's really difficult to count out Elves Brener at the minute. The one thing I will say of the Kutateladze fight is Kutateladze was winning that fight comfortably, in my opinion. Won round 1, won round 2, was winning round 3. It was a bit of a comeback KO. But again, Brener was cut up as well. But again, Brener just stayed in the fight. He was tough, he was gritty, he was durable. He ended up stopping Kutateladze with the body shot, so the TKO. And this is what I mean, like, Brener can be losing the entire fight and still have fight in him. The dude is a decent striker, better striker than I gave him credit for before he came into the UFC. He can wrestle. His grappling is where his base is, of course, being Brazilian. I'm not putting all the Brazilians in the same pool there, but his jiu-jitsu is, of course, very good. And yeah, he's a fighter that's tough to back against. But then Esteban Ribovics, he's a striker that doesn't look like he's got too much power, but the power is definitely there. It's deceptive. He can knock you out, and he will catch you. He's got fast hands, but then he can also wrestle and grapple himself. So even when he's on his back, he'll look for these Kimura sweeps, or, well, he'll try and finish a Kimura if it's available, but if it's not, he'll sweep from the Kimura. He's a really, really tricky grappler to deal with, and it's a tough fight to call because Brenner's tough and durable. His striking's okay, but I do think that Ribovics has got that explosive power in this fight where he could potentially land that knockout shot that the two previous opponents of Brener were unable to land and were unable to finish the fight. And although Brener can wrestle, I don't know if the wrestling is going to be there early in this fight. And if it is there early, I don't know if it's going to be overly successful there. Ribovics, he can be taken down, but he can also defensively wrestle as well. He's a well-rounded fighter. So I kind of feel like at least in the early moments of this fight, maybe even for the first round, it's going to take place on the feet and it's going to give Ribovics a lot of opportunities to land on Brener, either hurt him and change the course of the fight so he can take over, or just knock him out cold. If the fight goes long, I can see Brener getting into it a little bit more. It would mean, in my opinion, that Ribovics has hit Brener with probably his hardest shots and not being able to get him out of there. That could allow Brener to take over, get some takedowns, get some top control time, and start to pull away with the fight late. So that's where I can see it happening for Brener. But like I said, I think there's going to be too many moments early in this fight for Ribovics to land on Brener. And Ribovics genuinely does hit very, very hard. He's accurate and he'll rip to the body as well. So I think Ribovics might be too much early for Brener, which leads me to siding with him slightly. For those reasons, I'm picking Esteban Ribovics to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Daniel Marcos versus Victor Hugo, the newcomer from the Contender Series. Originally, we were supposed to have had Daniel Marcos versus Daniel Santos, which would have been an insane fight. So, a little bit disappointed again that Daniel Santos is out of the fight. But look, Victor Hugo's a decent replacement. He's going to be 4 and he's active. And he's a fighter that, will try and bring it to his opponent. It's just, in this fight, although I think Victor Hugo could potentially score some wins in the UFC, I'd just be very surprised if this was Daniel Marcos's first loss as a professional MMA fighter, and of course in the UFC as well, considering some of the fighters that he has already fought, especially last time out against David Grant. I know a lot of people thought David Grant won that fight. I was a little bit on the fence. I did bet Daniel Marcos there, but I feel like Marcos was the more efficient striker. Again, I'm not going to get into a recap of that fight, but the fact is that David Grant is a legit fighter who's been in there and fought the best of the best and beaten some really good fighters as well. So it does seem like it's a step down for Victor Hugo. I think Daniel Santos might even have been a step down from David Grant if we're being fair. But Daniel Santos was certainly, in my opinion, going to be a more competitive fight than what this fight is with Victor Hugo. It's just with Victor Hugo, Marcos has got to mind his P's and Q's because he is a flash guy that, in regards to the flash finishers, throws big hooks, can land that. If that one shot lands from that one big hook that's thrown with everything behind it, and it lands on the chin of Marcos, then Marcos, of course, could get knocked out. The other thing with Hugo as well is looks to wrestle quite a little bit, and he's got nasty leg submissions in regards to knee bars and heel hooks, all that sort of stuff. So again, it's a P's and Q's job, in my opinion, for Daniel Marcos, because if that flash knockout doesn't come, if that wrestling isn't overly dominant, and then the submission game and the flash, grabbing a leg and a flash submission, for example, if that doesn't come, then I just don't see Victor Hugo winning the fight. Look, Marcos does a really good job of defending takedowns. Of course, he can be taken down. He's not immune to it. But because he's so good of a striker, a lot of fighters try to take him down. So I don't think Hugo's going to present anything that he hasn't dealt with before. Can Hugo get him down still? I would not rule it past Hugo getting him down because, like I said, Daniel Marcos is not immune to being taken down. But Marcos also does a very good job of popping right back up to his feet. The other thing that Marcos does really well as well is he fights well moving backwards. Now, Victor Hugo is a very forward pressure fighter, but Marcos is one of these fighters that can be very effective on the back foot. So almost, I compare it to like a footballer or soccer if you're listening in the US. I almost compare it to a footballer where if you can play well with both feet, it gives you much more of an advantage in a game. And it's similar with a fighter. If you can fight as well moving backwards as you can moving forwards, then you're more efficient as a fighter. So I kind of feel that plays in for Marcos as well. When it doesn't happen, or if it doesn't happen for Hugo with a knockout or if the takedowns or the submission, at some point I think he's going to get into a bit of a defensive shell where he's out of ideas and Marcos can press forwards. I think Marcos is a legit elite striker. I think he's going to be able to piece Hugo up defend the takedowns for the majority of the time. If he's taken down, get back up before he's in any danger. And like I said, I would just be very surprised, very, very surprised if Daniel Marcos' first loss as a fighter and in the UFC is against Victor Hugo, where he's already fought and beaten a better level of competition than Hugo. So yeah, for those reasons, I'm picking Daniel Marcos to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos versus Rinat Fakhretdinov. And I think this is a pretty bad fight for Zaleski, if I'm being honest. Fakhretdinov is definitely a fighter on the rise at the minute. You know, he's looking like, where are you going to beat him? Because his wrestling looks world class. His top game is very heavy, very controlled as well. Always looking like he's going to be safe from any submission attempts that a fighter might throw on bottom. He's past that level where he's going to get hit with an armbar or a triangle from guard. But his striking looks dangerous as well. So it's, like I say, it's one of them that, look, where are you actually going to beat this guy? Now, from Zaleski's perspective, of course, naturally, he's a striker. I don't even know if he's going to have the speed advantage anymore. He's getting up there in age, Zaleski. I'm not saying he's declining to a point where he's toast or anything like that, but he's definitely, you know, dropped a gear or two in regards to the speed, the reactions. The last thing to go with a fighter is power. The first things to go is your speed and movement. So I do feel that, you know, if this was like 2 or 3 years ago, he'd have had a massive speed advantage over Fakhretdinov to the point where Fakhretdinov might have had to wrestle to win. But I actually think Fakhretdinov can strike with Zaleski and potentially hurt him and knock him out as well. I just don't think it's a great fight for Zaleski at all. Of course, if Zaleski does hit him with some spinning wheel kick or an elbow or a big punch and knocks him out, then of course that's, you know, that's a legitimate path to victory. But again, it's arguably a puncher's chance, if you like. Therefore, it's a small win. You know, it's a small percentage probability of it happening. If he does it, it's probably going to have to be early as well, so therefore a small window of opportunity. I think Fakhretdinov could strike with Zaleski, but again, if he doesn't even want to bother with that, if he decides to wrestle and grapple, big advantages there as well. So for those reasons, I'm picking Rinat Fakhretdinov to win this fight. And in the next fight, this is a fun one in the light heavyweight division. We've got Vitor Petrino versus Modestas Bukauskas. Now, Vitor Petrino's a fighter that I like quite a lot, if I'm being honest. Like, when he was in the Contender Series, he had a lot of power. He was known for brutally knocking opponents out, but then suddenly he's starting to wrestle and really, like, relentlessly wrestling. Like, that's his game plan, not his big power striking anymore. So, yeah, he's a fighter that's developing his game, that's looking like he's got different ways to win fights. And, you know, he's an interesting fighter, and he is very early in his UFC career. There is still some elements of him being a little bit green, in my opinion, but he's a fighter that definitely want to keep an eye on and see how high that ceiling goes. Because at the minute, it does look like the potential's there, but it's hard to say until we've seen him against a better level of competition. In comes Modestas Bukauskas, because Bukauskas, in my opinion, is by far the best fighter that Petrino's fought. He's a very well-rounded fighter, so he's got the good striking, he's got good wrestling, good grappling. Again, Bukauskas, like I said about Daniel Marcos, he's not immune to be taken down, he can be taken down, but he does a good job of getting back up. Now, Petrino last time out against Marcin Prachnio didn't have any answer for defensive grappling. Bukauskas will have answers there, so I don't think Petrino is going to take Bukauskas down and then just control him for a round after that and just beat him up on the mat. Bukauskas is better than that. And you look at the Anton Turkalj fight that Petrino had, I think this fight is more likely to look like that fight than the Marcin Prachnio fight, if that makes sense. Like in that fight, there was 7 takedowns for Petrino, 5 takedowns for Turkalj. Turkalj was hitting, you know, sweeps and reversals on the mat as well. And look, I don't think Turkalj is the best fighter, if I'm being honest, from a UFC caliber perspective. Of course, I'm not going to shit on a fight that's in the UFC, but I think Turkalj is at the lower end of the division. I think Bukauskas is a better version of him. So if Turkalj was having that sort of success against Petrino, then I think Bukauskas can as well. And that's where I feel like there's still an element of Petrino being a little green. That first loss, in my opinion, is definitely soon for Petrino. It's somewhere around that corner, and I think it could be on Saturday night against Bukauskas, because he's one of these fighters, these ex-Cage Warriors champions that are just battle tested, good everywhere. I don't think Bukauskas shines in one specific area, but he's good enough everywhere to be effective. He's also fought and beaten better level of competition than A, Petrino, and B, the opponents that Petrino's fought as well. So yeah, look, either Petrino's leveled his game up again, and the one thing that I will say with Bukauskas, before I get onto that, is the last time out against Zach Pauga, the one thing that really concerns me from that fight to this fight is Bukauskas had his chin up in the air, wide open, and he was hittable. If that's the same, if Bukauskas does the same thing in this fight, then he's probably getting knocked out, because Petrino does hit very, very hard. And Petrino, yes, he has been wobbled and dropped, and Bukauskas hits hard himself, but Petrino's relatively durable as well. I do think Bukauskas got to clean that up. But the thing is, I've not seen that from Bukauskas. I've not seen those defensive vulnerabilities that I saw in the last fight in his entire career previously. So, or the entire career that I've watched, should I say. I've not seen every fight, but I've not seen that defensive flaw before. So I don't know whether it's an anomaly, a one-off. I'm not sure. Definitely got to be careful. But back to the conclusion. Look, either Vitor Petrino has leveled up yet again, and he does have a style that's going to be so overwhelming for Bukauskas that Bukauskas can't get his game going, or we are going to see Bukauskas being that step up in competition that might be that loss that we're looking at potentially coming soon. I'm going to side with a guy that I think is really well-rounded. I didn't like some of the things that I saw with Petrino's game against Carly from a defensive perspective, things that I think Bukauskas can definitely take advantage of. So for those reasons, I'm picking Modestas Bukauskas to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Angela Hill versus Denise Gomes. Now, this is a really interesting fight, especially from the betting perspective as well. And I talk about this quite a lot in regards to the breakdowns and the bets that are behind the subscriptions at MMA Play 365 as well. And what I'm talking about is recency bias and market overcorrection. I generally do a decent job in noticing market overcorrection and recency bias in the betting lines. I'm not saying I get it right every time, of course I don't, but I do generally and genuinely do a good job of spotting it. And this fight does seem a little bit like a market overcorrection. It's not recency bias. I'm talking about Denise Gomes. Look, she was an underdog in her last two fights against Bruna Brazil and Yasmin Haruge, and she finished both fights looking absolutely outstanding. So it's not recency bias because she's beaten and finished two really good fighters, in my opinion. So there's no recency bias there. It's just she did a really good job and she's better than what we thought she was. But the market overcorrection is what comes into play here. Because she was an underdog in both of those two fights and she's finished them both, she cannot be an underdog against Angela Hill. If you put this fight in between or before any of those last two fights, so in between the last two fights or before the Bruna Brazil fight, Denise Gomes is a big underdog in this fight as well. It's just because she's been a big underdog twice and she's finished the fight in this division as well, she cannot be an underdog in this fight, in a fight that she might well have been an underdog before. So be very careful with the market overcorrection. However, Angela Hill is one of those fighters where, she's been around for years. She's fought the best of the best. She's a veteran. She's not going to see anything, in my opinion, in this fight that she hasn't seen before. That doesn't mean she can't lose the fight, because Denise Gomes is what seems a very dangerous and explosive fighter. So Angela Hill is one of those fighters where, again, she's been a little bit inconsistent as well. She went on a little bit of a run, but she does tend to trade wins and losses quite a bit, even if it's not trading them exactly, even if it's a couple of wins and a couple of losses and a couple of wins. So she's not the most consistent fighter, and that's where it becomes a little bit tough to really cap this fight from a betting perspective. But like I say, the market overcorrection is there on Denise Gomes because there's no way she can be an underdog in this fight. But does that mean that she loses the fight? Recency bias would say she would, but I don't think there's recency bias here. I'm struggling to pick Angela Hill. Like I said, she's a little bit inconsistent. Denise Gomes is the fighter on form that's finished two fights in a row, two fights that against good opponents that she was due to lose against, or at least capped to lose against. And yeah, I just think that Hill will be competitive in this fight. It's probably going to be one of these fights that goes to a decision, that is going to be very close. I don't see Gomes knocking Hill out like she did with her last two opponents. I think Hill's Muay Thai and the defense is a little bit too good for that, but I do think it's a fight that's going to be ultra competitive, that goes the distance, that could end up being a split decision. So yeah, I mean, for me, like I said, I'm going to go for the fighter on form, with coming off 2 wins, back-to-back finishes against a fighter that, even though she's a veteran, performances are a little bit inconsistent. So for those reasons, I'm picking Denise Gomes to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Montserrat Ruiz versus Eduardo Mora. Eduardo Mora fought not so long ago on the Contender Series, looked great in doing so, and she's a big favourite in this fight. I can kind of understand it. Look, Montserrat Ruiz, her best part of the game probably seems to be those head and arm throws, and then just controlling from that scarfold neck cramp type of position where she's not looking for the scarfold neck cramp. That's, you know, the best way I can describe it to the people listening. And again, she can get reversed from that position as well. We've seen it. It just takes a little bit of time, because it does seem like that grip in the headlock and the tightness and the strength of that headlock looks to be very tight. But the thing is, I don't see those types of takedowns working against Eduardo Mora. And Eduardo Mora, she doesn't mess around too much with the striking. You know, she will look for the wrestling. Montserrat Ruiz, her path to victory here is probably trying to keep the fight stood up, even though her best part of the game is probably those head and arm throws. So it's a bit of a strange one. But I think Eduardo Mora is the more willing to engage in the wrestling. She's got more of a traditional wrestling style where she will look for a double leg, and obviously, of course, if it doesn't happen, she'll look for trips and throws on the cage. She'll also look to try and take you back on the cage, you know, sneak around the back. I just think she's going to do a better job of offensively getting this fight to the mat, and her on top versus Ruiz on bottom, I just think it's a complete mismatch. On the feet, not really sure where the fight or how the fight plays out, if I'm being honest. There's not a huge amount of tape on Mora, but I would imagine it to be relatively close on the feet, as, you know, an educated guess, but that's not where I see this fight being won and lost. I do think Mora's going to engage in the wrestling. I do think we're going to see Ruiz on her back quite a bit. I'm not even sure if Montserrat Ruiz stays in the fight for too long whilst Mora's on top of her. Maybe she rolls and gives her back and Mora takes her back and chokes her. But I just feel that Mora's wrestling is better, and her topside grappling is going to be way too much for the defensive grappling of Ruiz. I can't look past Mora here, but of course, crazier things have happened in this game. However, as for the pick, I'm picking Eduardo Mora to win this fight. And finally, the last fight to break down. I'm not sure why it's the first fight of the night. Maybe the bout order gets changed, but we've got the newcomer Caio Fernandes versus Mark Diakiese. And I think it's a bit of a strange matchup in regards to what the UFC have done here, because Caio Fernandes looks like he could potentially be exciting. He could be in some really fun fights, and I'm sure he's going to get wins in the UFC, but stylistically, it looks like a fight that Diakiese should just have the upper hand wherever the fight goes. Like, from a striking perspective, I think Diakiese is more solid. He's got more variety to his striking. I think he's the more experienced striker as well. And then when you look at the wrestling, like, it's very hard to take Diakiese down, and if he is taken down, he does a really good job of getting on a hip, making it hard to keep him down and standing back up. And from the grappling perspective, like, Diakiese is a legit grappler as well. So where does Caio Fernandes win this fight? It's really tough, because I just feel that even from a defensive perspective, Caio Fernandes can get taken down. We've seen him controlled on the mat as well, and that's one of Diakiese's favourite ways to, you know, game plan in his fight, is to take his opponent down and just suffocate them on the mat. You know, we see it quite a lot from him, and he's very successful in doing so as well. He's a good wrestler. Then I've also seen Caio Fernandes tired after round one, after there's been a little bit of resistance and a little bit of fight back from an opponent. Caio Fernandes's gas tank can drain. Again, Diakiese's gas tank, he'll go all day long. Like, he's got one of the best gas tanks that we see in the UFC. He doesn't really tire. I can't remember a scenario where I've ever seen him tired. So, like I say, it's really tough to see where Caio Fernandes wins this fight. The one thing I will say is, look, Diakiese, it's a P's and Q's job for him again. He's just got to mind his P's and Q's. Like, the one thing that I will say with Caio Fernandes is, with his striking, he throws some really unorthodox stuff up. So, like, that lead head kick with inside boxing range. You don't normally see kicks with inside boxing range, especially not lead kicks as well. But in his last fight, he actually knocked his opponent out cold with one of those lead kicks inside boxing range, just because it's a strike that it's one of those strikes that's not typical of a fighter at this level, and therefore you don't expect it. And then when it's obviously landed in his last fight, that's why he's knocked his opponent out. But he has low-key looked for it in other fights outside of that fight. So it's just a little bit of a P's and Q's thing for Diakese. Early on, Caio Fernandes is going to be excited. He's going to come out fast, in my opinion. He's going to throw a lot of strikes at Diakese. Maybe there's a storm to weather, but again, the experience and veteranship of Diakese, I find it hard to see him losing this fight. I think it's a good fight for him. And like I said, it's a little bit of a strange matchup in regards to the UFC. So yeah, look, my pick's Mark Diakese to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of the podcast. It's good to be back. It's good to get UFC back as well. I'm really looking forward to this card in Brazil, in Sao Paulo on the weekend. Of course, if you want the betting advice from myself, the handicapper, or if you want to look at Bay's AI's predictions for this event as well to see where the AI is, or where and what the AI is liking, who's favoured, who's got the higher percentage, who's going to get the knockout, who's going to get the submission or decision, all that good stuff. You can actually get both the AI and my handicapper advice in one package as well. It's not two different packages that you have to pay separate for. So if you are interested from that perspective, jump onto MMAplay365.com. Other than that, really appreciate everybody listening and tuning in. And as always, if you're on YouTube, please drop a subscription to the YouTube channel. It really helps us. If you are listening on one of the podcast platforms, Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Music, and you want to jump over to YouTube, drop a comment on YouTube. Tell me who you're picking. Tell me where we disagree. We can always have that conversation. It is me that replies to the YouTube comments. So that's a direct way of having a quick conversation with me about certain fights. I'm going to stop rambling on. We're done now. I'm Newsom. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next week.